Miss Happiness and Miss Flower by Rumour Godden, Chapter 6. The dolls were to have a feast too. A tea party, said Nona. A tea ceremony, said Miss Flower. Belinda's dollhouse food was a cardboard ham glued on a plate, some plaster fish glued on another, and a plaster pink and white cake. That won't do at all, said Nona, and she went to see Mr. Twilfit to find out about a Japanese feast. In the end, a beautiful little feast was set out on the low table, a bowl of rice made of snipped-up white thread. Nothing else was fine enough. A saucer of bamboo shoots made of finely chopped grass, a saucer of pink and white sugar cakes made from crumbs of meringue cut round, and some paint-water tea. Green tea? Asked Belinda. Japanese people drink green tea. Huh, you know everything, said Belinda, who was in a very bad temper. Everything, she said. But there's one thing you don't know. What's that? Wait and see, said Belinda, and she looked angry and pleased at the same time. The dolls were dressed in new kimonos. Father had given Nona an empty cigar box, and she kept their clothes in that. Mrs. Ashton had made Miss Happiness a white kimono embroidered with a tiny pattern of leaves over an underdress of pale yellow silk and with a sash of blue. Miss Flower's was coral pink over an underdress of delicate violet color, and her sash was pale green. Their hair was brushed, and their socks and sandals had been painted. Tom had carefully patched the chip on Miss Flower's ear with some white paint and repainted Miss Happiness's shoe. We look quite new, said Miss Happiness. Is it really going to happen? Asked Miss Flower. Even though she was dressed, she could not quite believe it. It really is, said Miss Happiness. In the doll's house, the lamp and the firebox were switched on, and the lantern was lit. In the real house, the front doorbell rang, and it really is, said Miss Flower. Everyone brought presents. Melly had a packet of water flowers, the Japanese paper flowers that uncurl into brightly colored patterns when you drop them into water. You can put one or two in the shell for water lilies, said Melly. Mrs. Ashton brought a tiny paper sunshade she had once found in a cracker. It's from Japan, she said. Quite right, said Miss Happiness and Miss Flower. Miss Lane had brought her present in a matchbox. It was a length of paper 3 inches long and 1 1/4 inches wide. If you measure with your ruler, you will see how big it was. Top and bottom, it was held on 2 matchsticks that Miss Lane had sandpapered smooth and fine. The paper could roll up on them, and on the paper, in fine, fine painting, was some white plum blossom and a bird. The bird was no bigger than a pea. There was some writing, too, but so small that to read it you almost needed a magnifying glass, and Nona cried, It's my poem. My 2 plum trees are so gracious. See, they flower, one now, one later. Who could have done it? Asked Belinda. It looks like a fairy, but I think it was Miss Lane, said Nona. A scroll, a right-sized Japanese scroll, said Miss Happiness. But shouldn't the writing have been Japanese? Asked Miss Flower doubtfully. Not in England. That wouldn't have been polite, said Miss Happiness, and Miss Flower was satisfied. Nona hung the scroll in the niche. Soon I must make you a new one, said Miss Lane. This one is for spring, but you should change them with the seasons. Miss Happiness and Miss Flower gave 2 dolls nods, which means they nodded though you could not see them, and said, Quite right. Anne had made 2 pleated fans, no bigger than your fingernail. It says they should wear fans for the tea ceremony, said Anne. Very right, and Miss Happiness and Miss Flower were glad when the fans were tucked into their sashes. Tom had made 2 tiny pairs of wooden clogs, of the kind Japanese ladies used to walk in the mud, fastened with a loop of scarlet cotton. Oh, Honorable Tom, said the dolls. All the presents were beautiful, but the best of all was Mr. Twilfit's. He had brought 2 trees. Are those trees? Asked Belinda. Real trees? A pine and a willow, said Nona, looking at the labels. She sounded dizzy, as indeed she was, for how many people have heard or seen a pine tree 10 inches high and a willow only 7? But they're real, alive, cried Nona. Quite real, said Mr. Twilfit, his eyebrows going up and down. I didn't know, said Miss Flower with great respect, that there was anything like that in England. England is indeed a most honorable country, said Miss Happiness. They are grown for people who make sink gardens, said Mr. Twilfit, dwarf gardens in sinks or basins. Everyone was so enchanted that he was beginning to feel shy, and his eyebrows grew still. Better plant 'em, said Mr. Twilfit abruptly, and he turned away to look at the house. As he looked, he forgot to be shy, and his eyebrows began to go up and down again. "The president couldn't have made it any better," he said to Tom. The best of a doll's house garden is that it takes only 5 minutes to plant a tree. Nona planted the pine by the shell, the willow by the stream. They made the garden look exactly like the gardens in the book. Then Nona turned to the dolls. She made them bow to the company, which means all the people there, and said, "Miss Happiness and Miss Flower, will you come into your home?" But before they could be made to walk up the path, bordered with shells and past the tubs of a lady's slippers, Belinda spoke. "Not Miss Flower," said Belinda. "She's mine." "Belinda! Belinda, you're not going to spoil it?" "Yes, I am," said Belinda. Mother had taken Belinda to the playroom to talk to her. Belinda stood hard and angry by the table. Her cheeks were red and her eyes very blue and bright. She argued with Mother. "On the parcel it said the Misses fell. You said Anne was too old for dolls and we could have one each. You said so," argued Belinda. "But that was long ago," said Mother. "Miss Flower's mine," said Belinda. "You can't take her away from me." "It's just that you don't want Nona to have her," said Mother sadly. "Oh, Belinda, Belinda." "I don't care," said Belinda. "That's true," said Mother. "You never cared or thought about Miss Flower or wanted her." "I want her now," said Belinda, and she took Miss Flower and threw her into her own doll's house and slammed the door. Belinda ate her tea very quickly. Her cheeks were still red, her eyes an even brighter blue. She talked a great deal and said funny things to make everyone laugh, but it was an odd thing that nobody laughed at them except Belinda. No one else really talked, and nobody ate very much. Nona ate nothing at all, and her face looked white and sick with disappointment. Belinda saw Melly steal a hand into hers, and, "Can I have another meringue?" asked Belinda, and when she put it into her mouth, she laughed and blew the sugar crumbs all over the table. "I think we will go into the drawing room," said Mother. "Belinda, you had better finish your tea alone." In the doll's house, the lantern threw a soft light into the house, where the front was open and the screens had been slid back to show the garden. The lantern made a reflection in the looking-glass stream and gave the tiny trees real shadows. Miss Happiness knelt on her cushion in front of the table set ready for the tea ceremony, but she did not touch any of the tea. Opposite her was the blue cushion, empty, and a little empty bowl. "Oh, why couldn't Miss Belinda have taken me?" mourned Miss Happiness. "That would have been dreadful enough, but she was stuffed fuller than Miss Flower, and her plaster had not been chipped. Miss Flower wanted the house even more than I did," mourned Miss Happiness. "She was always frightened." If dolls could have tears, I am sure they would have rolled down Miss Happiness's plastered cheeks. "Oh, I am afraid," cried Miss Happiness. "I am afraid that Miss Flower will not be able to bear it. I am afraid she will break." There was certainly not a sound or movement in Belinda's dollhouse, not the smallest doll rustle. When tea was over, the guests quietly went home. "Shan't we play any games?" asked Belinda, astonished. "We would rather not play with you," said Anne. "Because you're a little rotter," said Tom. Belinda put out her tongue at him, which was not at all pretty, for it still had crumbs of meringue sticking to it. "You had better go upstairs," said Mother. Nona put out the lantern and switched off the lamp and the firebox. She washed the bowls and platters and put them away. Then she unrolled the blue quilts. The pink one stayed in the pencil box cupboard, and gently she laid Miss Happiness down and covered her up. Miss Happiness looked very small and lonely in the big room, and when Nona slid the paper screen shut, they made a shh, like a sigh. Belinda sang and danced all the time she was going to bed. It was odd, then, that the house should have felt so silent. Tom and Anne had gone to their rooms to do their homework. Usually they did it with friendly calls from room to room, but now they shut their doors. Nona had got into bed without a word and lay with her face turned to the wall. Downstairs in the drawing room, Father and Mother talked in low tones. "What a fuss about a doll," said Belinda. No one answered. She half thought of going to the doll's house and taking Miss Flower out and throwing her at Nona. But "I'll be darned if I will," said Belinda. Saying "be darned" like Tom made her feel very big and important, and she shouted and gargled as she did her teeth. The house stayed quite silent. Belinda always went to sleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. Only once long ago, when she had had a cold, she had woken up in the night with a sore throat and stuffy nose. She had not got a cold now, but there seemed to be something the matter. She tossed and turned and twisted. She heard Anne and Tom go to bed, and then later, hours and hours, thought Belinda, Mother and Father came up. "I can't go to sleep," called Belinda. It did not sound loud. It sounded like a bleat. But Mother did not come in or give Belinda a glass of hot milk as she had had that other night. Mother went into her room and shut the door. Belinda was so surprised that she got out of bed and padded in her bare feet to Mother's door and knocked. Mother opened it a crack. "I can't go to sleep," wailed Belinda. "I'm not surprised," said Mother, and shut the door. Then Belinda felt something queer in her eyes and in her chest, as if something hot and aching were gathering and coming up. Quietly she went back to bed and burrowed under the clothes. But up the aching came until it spilled over. It was wet and splashed down on her pillows. It was tears. "It's no good crying." How often Belinda had said that to Nona, but sometimes it is good. As the tears soaked into Belinda's pillow, the hard, angry feeling seemed to melt away, and "I'm sorry," sobbed Belinda, "sorry." But she did not cry herself to sleep. She cried herself awake, perhaps more awake than she had ever been in her whole life. It is lonely for a little girl to lie awake in the dark when everyone is sleeping. And then Belinda remembered she was not the only one who was alone. Miss Happiness was alone in the Japanese doll's house. And what of Miss Flower? Miss Flower was worse than alone in Belinda's dollhouse. Belinda had thrown her in and slammed the door. "I threw her quite hard," thought Belinda. "Did she break?" And suddenly Belinda was more miserable than ever, so miserable that she could not stay in bed any longer. She had to see what had happened to Miss Flower. "What did I do to Miss Flower?" asked Belinda, and more tears ran down her face. She got out of bed and tiptoed to the playroom. When the doll's house door banged shut on Miss Flower, I think she fainted. That was just as well, for when Belinda found her, she was lying on her back, with one foot in the air, her head under a broken chair, and her hand in the doll's house wastepaper basket, in which there was an earwig. Her kimono and hair were covered with dust, and the chip had opened again under the white paint into a trickle of plaster. But Miss Flower knew nothing until she felt a gentle hand come in and lift her. It was so gentle that she thought it was Nona's. She never dreamed it could be Belinda. Very gently, Belinda lifted Miss Flower, put her legs straight, dusted her hair and clothes, and shook the earwig off onto the carpet. Then she stood holding Miss Flower in her hand and wondered what to do next. Suddenly she tiptoed into Nona's room, where the Japanese doll's house was shut and dark on the windowsill. As Belinda slid the screen walls back, they did not make a shh like a sigh, but a shh as if there were a secret, as indeed there was, for carefully, with 2 fingers, Belinda opened the pencil box cupboard and took out the pink quilts. Carefully she unrolled them, and how clumsy her fingers were, though she tried to be careful. She unrolled the quilt beside Miss Happiness and carefully put Miss Flower in and covered her. Then she slid the screens shut and tiptoed back to bed. She was quite comfortable now, and she went to sleep at once. End of chapter 6.